Professor Ebba Koch is Professor of Asian Art at the University of Vienna. She is the leading authority on Mughal architecture and has published the definitive monograph on the Taj Mahal, the complete Taj Mahal. Professor Koch, could we begin with an overview of Mughal architecture and Mughal emperors as architectural patrons? And could we discuss North India as the setting for the most ambitious of Mughal architectural projects?
Yeah, I think it will be a good beginning to start our discussion on the Taj Mahal.
So, could you give us an overview of Mughal architecture and Mughal emperors as architectural patrons?
Yes, that's of course a big sort of issue, because the Mughals from the very beginning, were very interested to represent themselves as rulers in the eyes of a wider public, and architecture was certainly a means for them to do so. So building was given much attention, and we also have interested participation on the part of the patrons, on the part of the emperors in the creation of the buildings. So, and obviously, I mean, it starts with Babur, who came here with his followers to Hindustan and laid out gardens. And then under Humayun, we have not so much surviving evidence, but then under Akbar we get great building activities. He founded the large fortresses of Agra and also at Lahore. He made also contributions here to the architecture of Delhi. So really then by this time architecture becomes a major means for the Mughals to establish them here in India. And then under Jahangir we get interesting developments, new things are tried out, experimented with, and also with regard to the use of different materials, different forms of inlay, for instance. And then under Shah Jahan, of course, it's something which we can describe as a classical phase of Mughal architecture, where the earlier ideas are brought into a system, and this systematic approach to the architecture and its aesthetic appeal makes this sort of period so very interesting. And then, of course, under Aurangzeb, there is probably less architectural patronage. So we get great buildings, for instance, the Badshahi Masjid at Lahore also.
And Aurangzeb's period.
Aurangzeb's period, yeah. So we still get, but then of course the first 6 Mughals are called the great Mughals, and within their sort of span of reign here from 1526 to, let's say, 1707, we get the most interesting developments.
But Babur and Humayun weren't great builders, were they?
No, yeah, we have, I mean, of Babur's time, as I said, we have especially garden foundations, because the Mughals were used to reside in gardens. This was part of their Timurid, their Central Asian tradition. And then, I mean, Humayun had very interesting projects, which are described by his historian Khandemir. For instance, a floating palace on the Jamna, or a floating market. And he also obviously started to build Dinpana, his own capital here at Delhi, which was then taken over and continued by Sher Shah Suri, who ousted him so when he had to take refuge in Iran. But Humayun had some very interesting ideas, and I think the idea of this floating boat palace, where 4 sort of wooden pavilions were fixed together, in a way inspired the design of the tomb of Humayun, which we see here behind us.
What is this? Like, these are sort of monuments built on islands, river islands?
No, these were wooden pavilions to float on the Jamna.
Wow. So like boats?
Yeah, boats, but 4 of them bound together with arches, which would correspond to the 4 large corner elements of the tomb here.
Okay.
But instead of the dome, which we see here in the tomb, there was a pool, an octagonal pool in the center. So,
there are textual references to such
we have
because obviously nothing
descriptions.
is survived.
Very little survives. Very little survives of Humayun's. I mean, of course, the octagonal pavilion in the Purana Kila, in the old fort, which he used as a residence, is ascribed to him. But it's also possible that it was built by Akbar, because Akbar also used Delhi for a short time as a residence. Of course, he was very young at this time, so he wouldn't have been the one who commissioned the building. But it tunes in very well with the early architecture of Akbar's reign. So it's also possible that it was built by Akbar.
Mughal architecture is a coming together of numerous different influences, isn't it? Central Asian, Persian, Indian architectural traditions.
Yes, one can say the Mughals were great syncretists. And we have a very interesting statement of Akbar in a letter he writes to Shah Abbas of Iran, because he gives here this sort of, this openness towards different cultures. He gives it a political meaning, because he reproaches Shah Abbas because he was biased in the matters of religion, and said because he was open to all religions and to all cultures, it gave him the right to rule above them all. So, universalism also as a ruling ideology, right?
Ruling legitimacy.
And this was reflected in the use also of architectural traditions. Obviously, Central Asian Timurid was very important at the beginning, because this is what the Mughal knew, what they knew, yeah. But then they were fascinated what they found here in India by the ancient traditions of India, and then also remained sensitive towards the cultural norms of Iran. We also have to understand that a great part of the ruling elite came from Iran, so here in India they became Mughal. And then also a new awareness of Europe comes also in.
That comes at a later stage.
Yeah, at a later stage, especially under Shah Jahan, in architectural ornament. We would have it in certain architectural forms, the vocabulary, so we have some references. Yeah.
And in painting?
In painting very much so. In painting very much so, yeah.
So was Akbar the first of the great Mughal builders, considering that he built this network of fort palaces in Delhi, Agra, Ajmer, Lahore, Srinagar?
Yeah, no, we can certainly say so. And at this time also the nobility started to build. So Mughal architectural patronage was put on a wider basis also, and you have engagements with regional styles also.
Okay.
So it's very interesting, how elements of the regional architecture are integrated into mainstream imperial architecture. Of course, Akbar founded the Red Fort of Agra too, so this was really, fortification architecture also brought to an aesthetic level. Anyone who has seen the Red Fort and see how well all these defense elements of the architecture, how carefully and beautifully they are done. And also the historian of Shah Jahan tells us the stones were so closely set together that even, the sort of imagination couldn't fit into it.
Wow.
So we have this metaphorical way also about talking the architecture, which is very nice. And then Akbar left us this wonderful, testimony of his reign, namely Fatehpur Sikri, which is very well preserved. It's, I think, quite a unique ensemble of a palace city, so to say. And here we see also how the different regional styles of India are brought together and clad in this red sandstone, which also had a symbolic connotation because since ancient times it had been the color of kings. We remember that the Byzantine emperors are the ones born in the purple chamber, so this color red had a regal connotation. And also in Mughal times, red tents were a prerogative of the emperor, only occasionally granted to the princes as a special favor. So we have, and red then of course was in a way also hiding the stylistic clashes which would result out of bringing so many different architectural styles together. But we know that the Mughals were particularly fascinated by Gujarat. The styles of, so this would be the, Gujarat, Western Rajasthan, sandstone style, and also by the architecture of Bengal. So Abul Fazl, the historian of Akbar's reign, mentions this as exemplary styles of India.
What do you mean when you say that the color red was associated with the emperors? I mean,
yeah, no, it's a color used by kings since ancient time, and the Mughals were very aware of this tradition because also their own tents for their personal use had to be in red color.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the red sandstone, the preference for red sandstone is to a large extent a repetition. It's symptomatic of that preference.
Yeah, and then also it ties with ideas we find in the Shastras. These are prescriptive texts, ancient Indian texts, who sort of suggest how a proper building should be done. And here we have red, as a color recommended for the warrior caste, for the kingly caste, and white for the Brahmins. And by using these two colors in their buildings, because then later, already in Akbar's time, we have use of white, but then under Jahangir and Shah Jahan, it becomes a real system. So it seems, at least this is what I suggested when I read the Vishnu Damodara Purana, where these ideas are sort of put down in writing, that the Mughals wanted to associate themselves architecturally with the highest level of the Indian caste system. So in a way one can say they wanted to be the new Brahmins and the new Kshatriyas of their time. And
so we'll come to that. I'll ask you to repeat that sort of argument of yours when we talk about the Taj Mahal. But before we move on to the Taj Mahal, could you discuss the concept of the Chahar or Char Bagh, and what did the Mughals do with this concept?
The idea of the Chahar Bagh is floating around in the literature on Islamic art, and of course we have it in the early period, but the most monumental and the most clearly expressed Chahar Baghs in the entire history of garden architecture we find only under the Mughals. Like here in the tomb of Humayun, where we have this idea of a Chahar Bagh. This is a garden which has a form of a square and then is divided by two garden walkways into four parts. So we have a cross-axial division, and then the individual sort of quadrants can again be subdivided. So we have it here expressed in this perfect symmetric form, and it's hard to put your finger on a predecessor anywhere in the history of the Chahar Bagh, where we have a Chahar Bagh on such a grand scale and so well developed in its symmetry. So basically one can say it's probably a Persian idea which was taken up by the Timurids and then perfected by the Mughals.
So it's more of an abstract concept till the Mughals start building very monumental Chahar Baghs.
No, you have Chahar Baghs and the term defines the term, but for instance in Babur's time it's used for gardens which are not so strictly symmetrically planned. It could be applied for a formal garden which had paved walkways, but not necessarily such a strictly geometrical form. So it seems, I have discussed this with my colleague Lisa Golombek, who is an expert on Timurid architecture. it seems that you have, when you do aerial photography and do satellite photography, you find already regular Jaharbachs in Central Asia, but they would have to be excavated to determine their form, in a clearer way. Yeah.
Maybe in a while we could walk around the Humayun's tomb where we are, and you could discuss sort of the Mughal garden and the concept of the Charbagh in some more detail.
Yeah, we can have a look at it right here, because this garden has been restored recently by Radish Nanda and the Aga Khan sort of cultural trust. So it certainly can give us an idea, since we are not at the Taj right now,
Yes.
but to evoke this sort of concept
So,
in an earlier form. Yeah.
so to what extent is the Humayun's tomb a precursor to the Taj Mahal, as it is popularly called?
Yeah, and very rightly so, because the garden itself. So in the Taj we have a different plan, and the tomb is not set in the center of the garden, where the four walkways are crossing,
end of the garden.
but at the end of the garden.
But here at Humayun's the tomb is centrally placed.
Yeah, so
The
this would be
mausoleum?
the classical forms which the Mughals used for mausoleums. We have it also in the tomb of Akbar at Sikandra, and also at the tomb of Jahangir at Lahore. And also we have lesser tombs of the nobilities, which were done according to the scheme. And of course, and the ground plan of the building itself, this is where the Central Asian architectural heritage of the Mughals come in, because it's based on a rather complex nine-fold plan with a large domed room in the center, rectangular halls in the middle of each side, which would correspond to the porches, and then corner rooms which are double-storied and also vaulted. So, and this very plan was then also used in the Taj Mahal itself, but in a sort of, one could say, in a simpler form even, yeah, and perhaps more harmonious form. But here the ground plan is sort of experimented with, and we have a very interesting solution too.
So
Yeah.
who built the Humayun's tomb? Was it Akbar or was it Humayun's wife, Haji Begum?
No, yeah, it was certainly an imperial project. So Akbar was quite young at this time, he was only a teenager. So he had obviously, a group who would sort of
Monitored it.
monitor it. And altogether, there are people who advise the emperor on planning, and we learn very little about them. We have a reference of Jahangir himself in the Jahangir Nama, so he refers to men of superior knowledge. Mardume Sahib Wukuf, whom he consulted when he rebuilt parts of Akbar's tomb after the architects, you wouldn't believe it, had constructed it according to their own ideas. This is something what they were not supposed to do. So then Akbar, Jahangir came, he saw the tomb, he didn't like it, and then consulted with his body of advisors, perhaps his spin doctors even. So they were there, but we learned little about them, because the emperor always, the first Mughal emperors wanted to be those who were also responsible for the concept of the building. So obviously this was done by a group of people around Akbar. And Haji Begum couldn't have been there when it was started, because she was on a pilgrimage at Mecca. But we know that she supervised the construction in the later phase. So it was completed in 72, in 1572. So Abul Fazl, the historian of Akbar, tells us that she supervised the construction. But of course, it's an attractive idea that a woman builds a tomb.
Yes,
but
yes,
in
and
the Mughal tradition, the tomb was always built by the son for the father.
Okay.
Yeah, we have it also you know, at Sikandra. So Jahangir will build a tomb for his father, Akbar, and
What about Jahangir's tomb?
built by Shah Jahan.
Built by
So
Shah Jahan.
yeah, so obviously he had the means, you know, because by this time Nur Jahan again supervised the construction, but obviously at this time, you know, she was sort of, you know, out of power and wouldn't have had the financial means anymore for such a huge construction. And it was a duty, it seems, in the Mughal traditions that the son would build the tomb for the father.
So let's move on to Taj Mahal as the culmination of Mughal architectural patronage.
Yeah.
Could we begin with an overview of Shah Jahani monuments or the monuments built by Shah Jahan?
All the monuments built by Shah Jahan?
Just an overview.
An overview. Yeah, I mean the first. I mean we learn from Shah Jahan's biographers that I mean from his historians that he was already keen on building when he was a prince. So he would do his garden, you know, in Kabul, and Jahangir also would write about it, how well he had done it. So it was acknowledged by Jahangir that Shah Jahan was really gifted for architecture, and so he entrusted the construction of Shalimar Gardens at Kashmir to him when he was still a prince in 1622. Because the Shalimar Gardens are not done in one go, but both phases were sort of in the hands of Shah Jahan. So one on the command of Jahangir when he was still a prince in 1622, and then 1634 when he came to Kashmir as an emperor for the first time. Then he extended the garden.
Okay.
So obviously we have the three gardens, I mean Kashmir, Shalimar, and at Lahore also the Shalimar Gardens, and here in Delhi we also have a Shalimar Gardens in the north of the city, not very well preserved, not built by Shah Jahan himself, but by the companion of his later years, Akbarabadi Begum. So this obviously Shah Jahan is a sort of, you know, builder
Shah
of.
Jahan had a companion, a female companion.
After Mumtaz died, she was his wife, yeah. So Akbarabadi Begum. So she rose in favor. Yeah, she rose in favor. And we also have her tomb in the Taj Mahal complex, one of the side tombs.
Yes, we should discuss that at length actually.
Yeah, so anyway, so much for the gardens. And then the palace, he started adding to the Red Fort of Agra and also to the Fort of Lahore, built big audience halls there. And then in 1639 also started with the construction of a new palace at Shahjahanabad and the new city. And then mosques also. Mosques were also important. I mean, at the beginning of his reign, he built a huge mosque at Ajmer too, in fulfillment of a vow that if he would come to the throne, then he vowed the construction of this mosque, and then a series of other mosques. Moti Masjid in the Agra fort was probably the last one. And the Jami Masjid here in Delhi, and also his daughter Jahanara built a mosque at Agra, and a couple of palaces also, besides ones which we see at Agra fort or Lahore fort or here in Delhi.
So Shah Jahan was a great builder.
Yeah, he was certainly a great builder, and we get very clear statements also in the histories of the time that this was really to leave a monument of a reign, you know, a testimony to his rule, and you know, architecture as an instrument of rulership also to deepen the respect in the eyes of the people, and also to raise his esteem in the eyes of rival rulers.
Okay.
So architecture, you know, so people see these great buildings, and then they are more inclined to obey the orders of the empire, because they are so impressed, you know, by the presence of these buildings.
So he sort of stamped his authority on the landscape through architectural
Yeah,
means.
very much. Yeah, he really saw. One can see architecture as a representation of himself, and so Lahore himself, the buildings speak with a mute tongue, Besaban, Bisabani, of the glory of His Majesty. So.
So Abu Talib Kaleem has
Yeah.
described Agra as a perfumed garden.
Yeah.
Is this why Shah Jahan chose Agra as the setting for the building project most close to his heart? You've discussed how once upon a time Agra had 35 gardens.
Yeah, even more, 44 though, in Shah Jahan's time. And no, we also have to understand that Agra was the first capital of the Mughals, also Babur. After he had sort of conquered Delhi, visited Delhi, he moved on to Agra and chose it as a capital. And so it was the first capital of the Mughal Empire. Delhi was, in a way, still seen as the city of the sultans. Yeah, I mean, the Mughals would visit it, the Mughals would pay respect to it, but they didn't reside here for a long time. So Agra was their first capital, Lahore was another one, because we also must understand that the court was moving around. These were still, not such consolidated times, so the presence of the ruler was necessary in different parts of the empire. And but Agra was seen as the main capital, as Darul Khilafat. This was, it even had a title, And Shah Jahan renamed it Akbarabad to honor his grandfather Akbar. And then the nobility resided in gardens there, lining the Jamna on both sides. And the emperor resided in the fort. And so when Mumtaz died so suddenly and so early at Burhanpur, so Shah Jahan obviously wanted to select a site for her tomb which formed part of this river-front garden city. And he also used the typical shape of the gardens of Agra with a terrace overlooking the Jamna and the Chahar, this cross-axial garden on the landward side, as the design, as a plan for the mausoleum. But it was expressed in a monumental form to show that this was to be, a replica of her house in paradise, an ideal building. But here, as still part of the riverfront city. That's an interesting thought, not built somewhere, but as part of the river. So she was to reside there, among...
in that beautiful ornamental
right,
setting.
Yeah, right.
So you've discussed the concept of the riverfront Charbagh, which is quite different from the Charbagh which contains the mausoleum in the center. Could you expand on that?
Yes, the Mughals obviously, Baba also describes this in his memoirs. When you build a garden, when you found a garden, you need water. Yeah. So and the main water source the Mughals had at their disposal was the large, slow-flowing rivers, not a sort of spring on a mountainside like in their native Central Asia. So they adjusted their garden form to this riverfront situation, and this is why this form of the Mughal Chahar has the main building on a terrace overlooking the river and the Chahar on the landward side. So it was a form specifically designed, if you so wish, for this riverfront situation, a very original contribution of the Mughals to the Chahar form.
Which Mughal specifically? Is this a format?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it starts already with Babur, because he describes in his memoirs how he sets over the river from the fort, looking for a site for the garden, and but we do not know exactly what forms these gardens had. And the first riverfront garden which is preserved dates from the time of Jahangir. It is a Rambagh, which was originally called Bahi-Nurafshan, and it was the garden of Nur Mahal, his wife. And here you have already a riverfront terrace on which the main buildings are placed. And then the form was perfected, symmetrically perfected and designed in Shah Jahan's time, and of course put on a grand monumental scale in the Taj Mahal.
So the Taj Mahal is above all a monument to love and indeed matrimonial bliss, isn't it?
Yeah, when I started writing this book and doing the research, I was a bit skeptical of this love story behind the Taj Mahal. I felt it had been magnified, you know, by the reports of the picturesque travelers who came to India at the end of the 18th century and in the early 19th century. So in Europe, this was a time of, you know, when romantic love was celebrated. You had the story of the sufferings of the young Werther by the German poet Goethe, who was sort of read in the whole of Europe as a story of unhappy love. Yeah. So I felt, you know, this story had been magnified. But if we go to the Mughal sources and read them carefully, the early historians of Shah Jahan, Yashaswini, so it's all there, you know, written down in great detail. How Mumtaz was for Shah Jahan the perfect companion, and not only it was a mental understanding, but also a physical one. They're very open here. To Hawaiian love, they use the word passion. And also said how he broke down, you know, when she died. So he became something, the way the sources represent him, like Majnun, yeah.
Pining for Layla.
Pining for Layla.
He had these allegorical paintings made of sort of, which likened him to Majnun.
No, I mean, I likened him to Majnun. The paintings were not commissioned by him, but Layla and Majnun became a sort of dear subject to Mughal emperors already under Jahangir, who had a tomb built for Anarkali at Lahore, on the tombstone of which is written, you know, oh, I would give thanks until the day of judgment could I ever see the face of my beloved one again. And then signed Salime Majnun Akbar, you know, the son of Akbar, or Majnun Salime Akbar, this way, you know, the madly in love, Salim, the son of Akbar. So there is already a precedent for Shah Jahan having his grief and unhappy love conveyed to history. Because it's one thing to feel it, but it's another story to have it recorded in the official history of the reign. That's an amazing thing about it. So this is how we came to know about it.
It seems to have been quite a remarkable relationship. I mean, they had practically a monogamous relationship in the context of a polygamous society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because obviously Shah Jahan was also married to other women, but again, Yashaswini tells us after he had engendered a child, which each one of them, they were his wives only in name, because his whole attention was devoted to Mumtaz Mahal. Yeah.
It really is a remarkable love story.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is. So even since I was a skeptic, I was converted. But it's very important also to study the historical sources. So on the one hand, we study the monument. On the other, obviously, the sources which give us the context in which a building was created.
But that's not all. In terms of Shah Jahan's motivations and hopes, in terms of the Taj, you have written that it was to testify to the power and glory of Shah Jahan. You have also written rather evocatively that the Taj Mahal was built with posterity in mind. We, the viewers, are part of its concept. So there are also political motivations behind the Taj Mahal.
Yeah, again, this is something which I deducted from studying the sources and altogether seeing the importance architecture had for Shah Jahan. And but this is very clear also. This is what the sources tell us. So that to the end of times, this monument was to testify to the power and glory of Shah Jahan, and given also what I had mentioned earlier, the importance of architecture to represent the ruler. Also, we have to understand Shah Jahan's form of governance. It was really a moment in Mughal history when the empire was very centrally administrated. And so this idea of control, this idea of absolute control was also extended on the architecture. So it's to have it built according to certain principles and according to sort of the systems which were worked out for the architecture to represent Shah Jahan.
So please discuss the Taj Mahal in terms of its three basic divisions: the mausoleum, the complex as it exists today, and the entire original complex.
Yeah, when I undertook the study of the Taj Mahal, and also the title I gave to the book, The Complete Taj Mahal, is a very ambitious one. But what I meant was, on the one hand, to plan the Taj Mahal in its context, in its urban context, as part of the riverfront city of Agra, and also to understand the entire concept, how it was originally built, because not everything of it survives. To the south of it, to the forecourt where we enter today, we had a huge complex which was a bazaar and caravanserai complex, and which interestingly had a cross-axial design, so it reflected the design of the domed garden, now transferred or translated into the forms of mundane architecture. A very ingenious concept. So altogether, originally the Taj Mahal was something like 893 meters long, and 300 meters wide. So a gigantic complex, quite unique in this way.
Much larger than what exists today.
Yeah, much. So this would be, to understand the entire complex, we have to understand that it was much larger, and it consisted of this part with the funeral garden and the mausoleum, and this mundane complex of bazaars and caravanserai street, which not only formally reflected the shape of the main tomb garden, but there was also a functional connection, because from the upkeep of the bazaars and caravanserais, from the income of the bazaars and caravanserais, the upkeep of the mausoleum was financed. So a very close connection between the different parts of the.
Shah Jahan's period consisted of sort of riverfront gardens along both banks of the river Yamuna, is it? But there is this opinion that perhaps the river Yamuna was included in the Taj Mahal complex, and that the formal garden on the other end of the Yamuna, what is known as Mehtab Bagh today, was in fact a part of the sort of larger Taj complex. What do you make of that argument?
Yes, this garden has already sort of raised the interest of early travelers, because we have a statement of Tavernier that Shah Jahan intended to build his mausoleums there.
The Black Taj.
The Black Taj, but we know from a letter of Aurangzeb to his father Shah Jahan that it was a garden also. When the Taj was built, it's referred to as Mehtab Bagh, and then Aurangzeb reports it has been flooded and sort of writes about it as a garden. Yeah? But interestingly, it has the same width as the Taj Mahal. And on the other side, we, on this riverfront terrace, which was so characteristic of the Agra garden, we don't have a large building. We have a small bungalow, and we have a pool. Yeah, and so it could be quite possible that this garden was conceived as a place from which to view the Taj Mahal. perhaps in moonlight, have the river in between as a place where the reflection of the Taj would be caught in the water. So this is quite a strong possibility. And so in this way it would be sort of integrated into the concept of the Taj, but not strictly as part of the complex, because it's not mentioned in the official description of the Taj Mahal, which was written by Abdul Hamid Lahore in February 1643, when the tomb was reported as having been officially completed. So it's not mentioned, but the Bazaar and Caravanserai complex is mentioned here.
So at best it was an adjunct to the Taj?
Yeah, something like a sort of extension on a sort of, in this concept of riverfront Agra.
So could you tell us about the subsidiary buildings of the Taj complex? I mean, obviously, to both on the sides of the Taj, there's the assembly hall and the mosque, perhaps.
Oh, you mean the subsidiary building within the garden, or outside the funerary complex?
I mean, in the complex, within the complex.
No, obviously, the general understanding is that the Taj Mahal just consists of this white marble mausoleum, but as a matter of fact, we have many more buildings. So the Taj itself is flanked by two identical buildings which correspond to this ideal, this principle of construction of bilateral symmetry, of mirror symmetry. So we have on the one hand towards the west, towards Mecca, a mosque, and on the other hand a building which is built for the sheer sake of symmetry, and it's an assembly hall, called Mehman Khana. But basically it's there to give balance to the building of the other side. And then we have the four great, garden walkways crossing the garden-like streets. In the center, a pool, and at the end of this axis of this transverse garden walkways, we have two pavilions, garden wall pavilions, and then we have the large gateway. Because I was sort of now coming from the river, but you enter through the large gateway, which is built in the south. And at the corners, we have towers on each corner. And the towers have an interesting interior life. One of them has a bauli, the one next to the mosque. So, and others have latrines. So they have different functions. And then beyond, you have the great forecourt, and flanked by quarters for the tomb attendants, the so-called haspuras, and then on both sides are courtyards for lesser wives of Shah Jahan. So we do not know their names, because the name of these imperial women, as a historian tells us, should not be on the tongue of common people. So they were called after the cities they came from. So one is Akbarabadi Mahal, she came obviously from Agra, and the other is Fatehpuri Mahal, she came from Fatehpur Sikri. And then beyond, further south, we had the Great Bazaar and Caravanserai complex, which I have mentioned earlier. So formed of four bazaar streets crossing each other, which correspond to the walkways of the garden. And then four sarais, or these were sort of inns for travelers, which correspond to the parterres, to the four sort of quarters of the funerary garden. And this, as I mentioned, so the income of these institutions was used to finance the upkeep of the mausoleum. So a large complex with different functions.
Is it not an extraordinary juxtaposition, the funereal and sort of the worldly, as you call it?
Yeah, so it relates to Islamic.
On one hand, there's this solemn tomb, and on the other hand, there's a bustling market, caravanserais. It's quite a startling combination.
Yeah, but in a way, it complements. They complement each other, because we have this concept of din wa dunya, in Islamic thinking, the worldly is opposite to the spiritual. So these two areas would reflect this concept.
When do you think?
Yeah, and also now I would like to add, and again we have inbuilt reception because already a contemporary of European observer says, that the travelers come here and then, they take the fame of this building to the whole world. So the idea of the world traveler, visiting the Taj is already there in its original concept. So obviously the travelers come to stay in the caravanserais and then they will report, about this great building.
When do you think the tombs of the lesser wives were added to the complex?
Yeah, it was done. Obviously, I mean the tomb of we have him a date, but it's a tomb which is outside the main complex. Right when you come in, you have it on the left side. It's commonly called the tomb of Fatehpuri Begum, but I think it was originally the tomb of Satyonissa Begum, who was a lady of waiting of Mumtaz Mahal. And so this was built in the 1650s, so quite late. And the official completion date is 1643 in the histories, but on the inside of the main gate we have an inscription which is dated 1648. So it means that the building of the decoration was still going on after the official completion date. And here in these inscriptions we get the name of the calligrapher, and he's the only artist, who was allowed to sign his creations, because the name of the architects have not come down to us. I think on purpose. They were suppressed in the sources because the emperor wanted to go down into history as the ultimate creator of this building. So the architects were there. Shah Jahan consulted them. We know he had daily meetings with his architects, but they were not allowed to sort of, sign or appear in inscriptions. Well, the calligrapher was, and I think this has to do because the word, is much venerated in the Islamic tradition, because, the word of Allah has been put down in writing in Quranic verses, and so obviously he had a different standing, and was allowed to put his name down. Amanat Khan Shirazi, so he was a calligrapher from Iran, from Shiraz.
That's interesting, considering that not even the name of the architect of the Taj Mahal is known.
Yeah, this of course for our thinking, where the architect, the great architect, and the work we ascribe to him plays such a great role, in our culture of today. So this is quite amazing. And interestingly, the painters of Shah Jahan, they were allowed to sign their works, and they were also allowed to bring themselves with their portraits into the court society of Shah Jahan, because in the great Dawa scenes we have self-portraits of the painters who did this court reception.
Holding portraits.
Yeah, right. And so the painters were allowed to make themselves literally a name, but the architects were not.
So you have called the Taj built architectural theory.
Yeah, that's a big theme, one can say. Yeah, obviously I was thinking about the old Shastric traditions of India, and how a building like the Taj would relate to it, sort of norms and suggestions how to build correctly, put down in these learned works written in Sanskrit by Brahmins. And but since we don't have we have detailed descriptions of the architecture, which is also very interesting, because nowhere in the Persian-speaking world around this time do we have such detailed descriptions of architecture. There's a firm sort of architectural terminology and exact description of the features and measurements. So that's quite unique, this assessment of architecture. but we don't have any theoretical reasoning about it. And then when I was studying the plans, which I prepared with Indian architects and sort of, it was possible in a way to abstract principles from the architecture itself, because the Taj is built so systematically that we can derive the principles to which it owes its sort of concept from the buildings themselves. So we have like geometrical planning or hierarchy or the sort of uniformity of shapes. You would always get, one type of vault or one type of column. And then we have tripartite formulas bound together in proportional relationships. So for instance, a facade would have a large element in the center, flanked on both sides by lesser elements. So you always have this triadic composition, so to say. Then we have something which is very interesting, so on the one hand the rational planning, which lays down the overall shape, but then this appeal to the senses in a very sort of sensuous treatment of the surfaces, marble relief, and inlay work, and then we have obviously also symbolism, which plays a great role. So because the sources tell us that the Taj Mahal was to be here on earth an architectural expression, an architectural relation, a realization of the house of Mumtaz in paradise. So interestingly, it's like a Platonic concept in reverse. The ideal is done here on earth in order to guarantee its existence in the other world. So a house for Mumtaz, a paradisical house, an eschatological house. So to express this, we have inscriptions, which are passages chosen from surahs of the Quran, which speak about the end of days, last judgment, and the reward of the faithful in paradise. So this is expressed in the inscriptions. And then we have this, this naturalistically done flowers, which transform the lower areas of the walls, the dados, into ever-blooming garden beds, one could say, to have this aspect of the paradisical garden sort of integrated into the house of Mumtaz itself. So this would be symbolism, which I think plays a very important role
in Shah Jahani architecture.
Yeah.
Quite austere in comparison with the Taj Mahal.
I mean, it's earlier, obviously, so it shows a different aesthetic, where geometry also in the exterior sort of appearance plays a great role. So we have less of this sort of highly, developed forms of ornament, like relief and this very precious inlay work with semi-precious stones. So basically, we have this rationality, of the geometrical planning of the ground plan is also reflected in the elevation. So each element of the plan is reflected in the elevation, and the white marble inlay highlights each component, its role in the elevation of the building. So in this way, you could probably describe it as more austere or more serious or more sort of representing more this sort of earlier approach of the Mughals.
What do you make of these chhatris?
Yeah, the chhatris are very interesting because Ratish Nanda has found out that originally they were covered with tiles, which he's planning to redo them, and of course this is something which would completely changes sort of all of red and white appearance of the mausoleum. But we do have also an Akbar's tomb in the Chandra. The Chandras originally were covered with tile work of similar colors we have here in the tomb of Humayun. So it's like a Central Asian quotation on this red and white, corresponding to the Shastric aesthetics of India, and then have these little chhatris covered with tile mosaic.
So you think that sort of that Shastric derivation that you talk of, red and white as the colors of the traditional ruling classes of Indian society, that begins as early as Humayun's tomb?
Yeah, very much so, and obviously the Mughals were not the ones to invent it, because we have it already in very early Sultanate architecture, beautifully done in the Alai Darwaza of the Qutub complex, which was done in 1311 by Alauddin Khalji. So obviously already the sultans thought on these lines, but then the Mughals sort of took up these ideas, and with their typical approach, rationality combined with the sense of the aesthetics, they perfected this use. And especially here to underline the function of each element, in the building. In this way, it's really like a, it's like a class on architectural composition, if you so wish. So we don't have this in Timurid architecture, where the ornament is rather used to sort of, sort of gloss over the individual elements of which the elevation is made. So that's a very sort of characteristic approach of the Mughals, and already here expressed in such a clear and perfect form.
So do these sort of subsidiary buildings, are they sort of symptomatic of the bilateral symmetry that you were speaking of?
No, here we have some on all sides. So it would be rather the central planning, which is sort of applied here. So at the end of each walkway, so we have the same large walkways, which we have also, let's say, in the Taj Mahal or in other Chahar Baghs, with a sunk channel in the center. So here the channel is rather narrow. In later Mughal buildings it would be wider. And then at the end of this walkway there would be a building. It could be either a real gate, so this obviously was the real gate because it was the southern one. This was originally the main approach, because from the south you would enter the tomb from the south. And then you have also buildings at the end of the other,
so the four
other
cardinal
avenues.
directions.
Right, four cardinal directions. Yeah.
And one real gate and three false gates.
No, here we have two gates. Here we have two. But in other gardens, for instance, Akbar's tomb at the Chandra, we have only one real gate. Again, the one in the south. Yeah.
What about the subsidiary monument?
Oh yeah, this is called the Barber's tomb. So yeah, but it has an interesting vault of it's again it's a Timurid vault form. A vault dome which sits on four arches crossing each other. So it's expressed here in this tomb in a very nice way.
The one you've discussed that there's a Quranic injunction against the building of very large monuments, very large tombs.
Yeah.
But the Mughals were as great. But large-scale tombs were built nonetheless because it became a mechanism for retaining land.
Oh, I think today we have a great responsibility vis-à-vis these monuments, because they are really outstanding architecture which deserves to be thoroughly studied, be understood in all of its aspects. And in this way, I think we could have more study of Mughal architecture. And of course, it's also a testimony to the time of the Mughals, which really gave so much thought and dedication to the creation of these buildings that they still fascinate people of our days to this large extent.
Professor Ebba Koch, thank you for your discussion of the Taj Mahal and other great Mughal mausoleums and Mughal architecture.